It's part of the AOD 101 series. And today we're going to be hearing about psychostimulants and ketamine. So all participants joining the webinar today are in listen and view only mode. And after the presentation, there'll be a question and answer session, and you can submit the questions at any time during the webinar. And in order to do that, please type your questions into the Q&A box, which is located at the bottom center of your Zoom screen. You may need to move your cursor or tap your touchscreen device in order to enter the question. The webinar is being recorded today and will be available for viewing once the whole series has come to an end. My name is Susie Hudson and I'm the Clinical Director here at NADA, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which all of us are meeting today. I'm currently on Gadigal land, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and to future generations. And for those of you who are new to this webinar series, joining me in a moment is my favourite person and wonderful colleague, Annie Bleeker. She's worked in the HIV, AIDS and alcohol and other drugs sector for the past 30 years. She's worked in Netherlands for 5 years, implementing peer education programs for people who use drugs. She's also spent 2 years working in Indonesia, training community workers on how to respond to alcohol and other drug issues and preventing the transmission of HIV. She's taught at several universities. She's worked in our sector, and she currently works as a senior training specialist for ATODA, which is our sister peak in the ACT. I'd like to welcome Annie to the screen now, and I will leave you all in her capable hands. Welcome, Annie, and over to you.
Thank you, Susie. Can you see me okay?
And, I sure can.
Yeah, and the screen's okay?
Beautiful.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you for that lovely welcome, and welcome everybody who's come back to the third in this seminar series. As Susie said, today we're going to update your information on psychostimulants, which includes MDMA or Ecstasy as it's commonly known, methamphetamines or ice as it's sometimes also reported, particularly in the media, cocaine and ketamine. So all of these drugs have been on the increase in New South Wales since the last survey. Like Susie, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose beautiful land we're meeting today. I'm talking to you from up in the Northern Rivers, which is the land of the Bundjalung Nation. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians on the land on which we meet and which you're all meeting today, and pay my respects to elders, families and their ancestors, and particularly extend that to any Aboriginal people that are online with us today. I'd also like to acknowledge the lived experience of many people that are participating in this seminar, whether that be with alcohol and drugs and or mental health. So as Susie said, these are the drugs we're going to focus on today. I'm also going to provide you with some harm reduction information relating to these drugs, and where we have information relating to COVID and how to reduce harm, I'll also provide that. So all the drugs I'm talking about today, with the exception of ketamine, which is a dissociative anaesthetic, are central nervous system stimulant drugs. So they basically make the blood and heart pump faster, and they reduce appetite and sleep. All of them produce euphoria, well-being and energy and wakefulness, and they all act to increase the activity of the neurotransmitters dopamine, noradrenaline and serotonin. So we're going to start off with MDMA. We've got a poll here. All your answers have been anonymised, so we won't know who got them right or wrong. But for those people who attended the first webinar series, you might remember this one. And basically what we're asking is, according to the National Drug Strategy Household Survey, what proportion of New South Wales residents over the age of 14 reported that they'd used MDMA in the previous year? So I'll give you about 5 more seconds to leave this poll open before we close it. Okay, I'm going to close it now. Thank you for all of those who participated. That was approximately half of you. So the correct answer was actually 3.1, even though most of you said 4.5. So this was an increase from the previous year. So what we're going to talk about first is MDMA. So about 3.1% of the New South Wales population reported using the drug. The chemical name of this drug is 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, and it was basically developed by a German pharmaceutical company in about 1912. And it was intended as a parent compound to synthesize medications that control bleeding. However, this didn't work, and so the drug was put back in the vault and basically rediscovered again by a guy that's commonly referred to as the godfather of ecstasy, Alexander Shulgin. And Alexander Shulgin was a chemist and a psychopharmacologist who resided in California, and him and his wife basically were using the drug in the 1970s and 80s for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder, but also as a kind of counselling tool. And they believed that it enhanced communication between patients and allowed them to provide insights into their problems. And it was during about 1985 that the drug started to become popular in America. And this was often referred to as the Summer of Love in the mid-80s, which coincided with the development of techno or electronic kind of music. It's often referred to as MDMA or MD or Ecstasy or any of those kind of like names. It has a bit of a reputation as a drug that's kind of pretty safe, and I guess it's one of the most difficult ones to educate young people about. But we are seeing that MDMA overdose or toxicity is increasing in Australia and around the world, and it can be fatal. We get about approximately 20 deaths a year associated with this drug in Australia, and we certainly in 2018 had 6 deaths amongst young people that had used it, and some had had as little as 1 pill, others has had as many as 9 pills. One of the dangers with this drug is that it increases the body temperature, usually by about 1 degree. And one of the health concerns that we have is dehydration or overheating or heat stroke, which can lead to something which is referred to as serotonin syndrome. One of the other things that happens with ecstasy is that it stops people from going to the toilet, and sometimes people get quite dark urine. So it's really important to drink a little bit of water, but not too much. So I've got some guidelines about that I'll talk to when we're coming up to the harm reduction information. Now, the potency of ecstasy in all forms of it, either pills or capsules or powder, is increasing around the world. So the main producer of the drug is the Netherlands, where I used to reside. And I guess one of the big concerns we've had during COVID-19 is that there were certainly a lot of drugs that were being produced in the early part of last year of increasing potency, and we're really worried with a lot of people not being able to go out, and certainly these drugs were decreasing during COVID, that people's tolerance might have reduced and we might see an increase of them. So in rare cases, people have suffered heart attacks and strokes after using ecstasy, and again, this is because it's of its stimulant type of properties. So it's often referred to as an entactogen, which is a stimulant with hallucinogenic properties. It produces strong feelings of comfort and empathy and connection to others, which is why it's often referred to as the love drug. We used to see it a lot more in pill form, but we're now seeing, a lot more capsules and crystal and powder on the market also in Australia. The average price seems to be about $25 for a pill or a cap. And you can also buy it in a point, which is 1/10 of a gram, and this averages about $25 for a dose. You can also buy it in larger amounts. So a gram of it costs for the powder about $200 for the crystal, and about $150 for the powder. The vast majority of people who use this drug swallow it, but it can also be snorted, although it's quite harsh on your nostrils. Some people also might shaft it, so that's put it up their bum, and some people also might inject it. And the duration of effects, it usually takes effect between 30 to 60 minutes. And I guess, where I'm saying with people now with the increased purity of the drug is that wait at least 90 minutes before you redose with the drugs, because again, without us having any drug testing or pill testing, particularly in Australia, we are seeing a lot of adulterants in there, particularly one called PMA, which can be really dangerous in raising your core body temperature. So it has a kind of a bit of a plateau type of effect. So most people will feel the the more loved up type of feelings in the first sort of 90 minutes to 2 hours. And then after 6 hours, people will no longer feel the after effects. But again, because this particularly works on serotonin, this drug, people can feel a bit of a residue come down or like a hangover effect a couple of days later. This was often referred to as a chemical come down and usually occurred on Monday or Tuesday. Now, most people don't become dependent on this drug, so we don't see anyone attending treatment for this drug. It's commonly used more often on weekends and when people would go out to party or maybe take it at home with friends. So it's not really something that people use kind of daily. We are seeing trials for MDMA-assisted therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder happening around the world, and some clinical trials looking like they're happening in Australia as well, although these are more likely to be happening in the US. Okay, so what does it feel like? Again, a lot of people feel a very strong euphoria when they take it, usually after about sort of 60 to 90 minutes. People can feel quite intimate with each other. They get an increased energy and confidence, might talk to people they wouldn't normally speak to, which is why it was quite popular in the kind of dance music scene. People can have a lack of inhibitions. In stronger doses, or if it's stronger or they have too much, people can feel quite nauseous, can get sort of sweating, and this can particularly happen when people kind of are dancing and not taking breaks. And again, that's why we would sort of say take 500 mils of water if you're dancing, half that amount if you're just sitting around talking to people. Again, the stimulant effects of it, people can experience jaw clenching and teeth grinding, which is why you might sort of see people chewing gum or sucking on lollipops, and these were very popular when the drug first became quite popular. So this is what the chemical come down with MDMA looks like. So this generally happens 24 to 48 hours after people have used the drug, and it's often the opposite effects of what it's like when people are high. So people are not feeling hungry. They might have sleep problems again because the serotonin's been used up. And generally this starts to, serotonin starts to increase again after 1 to 2 weeks. People can feel muscle aches and find it hard to concentrate afterwards. Again, as I said, there's not many in the literature. Certainly, if you look at it, we haven't sort of seen that, there's a lot of very, bad long-term effects associated with the drugs, although some people report they feel tolerant to the drug, so that means they take more of it to try and get the same effect. And there have been some reports of people experiencing depression and memory and cognitive impairment after they've used it a lot. This drug's pretty dangerous if you mix it with the MOIs, which are like the first generation antidepressant drugs such as nardilparnate and marpan. And this can basically lead to a potentially dangerous condition called serotonin syndrome and overheating. This can also happen if you take too much MDMA, which can be fatal. It's best not to mix alcohol or other drugs when using ecstasy, particularly other sort of psychostimulants, because of the high, intensity that can have on the heart. Alcohol can also mask the effects of MDMA. Other depressant drugs, so the newer generation SSRIs, don't interact dangerously with MDMA, but they might interfere with the effectiveness of those drugs. So again, it's best not to combine the two. So this is what a MDMA toxicity, or sometimes referred to as overdose, can look like. So again, this is a really kind of dangerous situation that can happen. And if you see any of these type of effects, it's really, really important that people go to medical attention and seek that immediately, because if they don't, once serotonin syndrome starts to happen, it's very difficult to reverse the effects of that. So as I said, we can, basically MDMA increases the core body temperature by about 1 degree. So this can be dangerous. And something like PMA, which is found in in some pills in Australia, not many, some pills in Australia, has led to serotonin syndrome, so seizures, paranoia, hallucination, and muscle rigidity. So really important to get people to medical attention if they're not feeling well. So basically the only jurisdiction that does any drug checking is the ACT, and they've been working with Pill Testing Australia. And this wasn't a fixed site. This was basically just happening at Groove and the Move festivals. I think one of the best things that we could do in Australia, certainly, because what we find, one of the things that happens when you've got drug checking is that it cleans up your drug market. And so there's not likely to be as many adulterants in it. So this trial happened in 2018 and 2019. And they basically tested about 170 different substances. 243 participants visited the service, these are the results from 2019. So the main drug that was found in the pills was MDMA, but they also found cocaine, ketamine, and methamphetamine. The really kind of important finding was that they found NE and pethylone, and this is quite a dangerous drug, like a research chemical drug that basically can lead to serotonin syndrome. So again, if you want to find out more about how the pill testing service works, just have a look. If you Google how does pill testing work, you'll find how these guys do it in Australia. I worked on the pill testing service in the Netherlands, and that was a fixed set place, and people would come and bring their pills in by Wednesday, and they'd get the results by Friday, and we could give really kind of specific information for them. So these posters are available on the left-hand side of your screen. They're in the public domain, and they're released by a UK organisation. Have got really good information there. You know, we found when I was working on the pill testing service in the Netherlands that, you know, up until about 2015, most pills contained about 80 to 90 milligrams of MDMA, which was seen to be a non-toxic dose for most people. So we could be really prescriptive in our harm reduction advice over in the Netherlands, where we could sort of say between 1 to 2 milligrams per kilogram is generally seen to be a non-toxic dose for most people. So again, without us knowing particularly what's in our pills, I think it's really important that we, you know, stay low. So, you know, give at least 90 minutes before you redose with the drug, because we, you know, again, we don't know what's in it. Take regular breaks from dancing. So drink about 500 mils of water if you're active, or half that if you're not active. Important to take regular breaks and chill out and reduce the risk of heart stroke. And if someone's overheating, as we said before, take them to a cool place. And you can see a lot of, you know, dance party areas often have a chill out area where people can go and take a break and just, you know, cool down a bit. These are, again, some of those kind of negative experiences associated with an MDMA toxicity. So make sure you seek medical advice immediately. And I guess, you know, the best thing to do would be to leave 4 to 8 weeks between using MDMA to minimise harm and to allow your serotonin levels to recover more fully. Okay, so also, again, New South Wales is dragging their feet in getting pill testing up and running, and it probably won't get up and running with this current government. But New South Wales Health does, you know, issue early warning systems when they do find pills that have been kind of like dangerous. So again, this is a health warning from last year about kind of Tesla pills containing sort of, you know, were fake kind of tablets. And then we sort of saw here, and this is a health warning that was just issued in 2nd of July this year, where they found 25C or Nbomi in MDMA powder, or sold as MDMA powder. And this is again a research type chemical. It's an hallucinogen, rumoured to be up to 100 times stronger than LSD. So it can cause a lot of kind of adverse health events. So until we get pill testing up and running, this is one way you can keep up to date with what's happening. I also want to give a big plug to Dancewise, which is run by the New South Wales Users and AIDS Association. So if you have clients that are using drugs and want more information around the kind of party drugs, Dancewise is a really good place to go for further information about these drugs. Okay, so we're going to look at methamphetamine now. So I've got another poll here for you. And this is basically asking about methamphetamine. So I'll just launch this poll. So if you use methamphetamine once, you will become dependent on it. Is this true, false, or don't know? This is something that certainly when there was a lot of media about the drug about 5-10 years ago, when Susie and I were doing a lot of education around this drug in New South Wales. And this was one of the things that was reported a lot about this drug. So I'll give you 5 more seconds to vote for those of you who haven't. Okay, all right, we're going to end polling. So share the results. So congratulations, those of you who picked false, you are correct. You can't get dependent on any drug when you use it the first time. But what can happen when you use it is that you have a really kind of like, I guess, positive effect on the drug, and that will make you want to use the drug again. So where we have higher levels of use in this drug is that those are already engaged in drug use. We also have quite high levels of methamphetamine use in a lot of Aboriginal kind of Aboriginal communities. So this is arguably, of all of the drugs, probably one of the most difficult ones to manage within the family situation. And this is because of the emotional deregulation that can happen with this drug. And, you know, it can, particularly when people get dependent on the drug, lead to some fairly messy behaviour. So it's a strong central nervous system stimulant, and it produces feelings of pleasure and increased confidence and energy and drive. It comes in crystal form, and that's crystal methamphetamine is basically, I guess, for those people who might have, you know, known speed powder had a potency of about 10%, whereas crystal methamphetamine, particularly since about 2010, has been about 80 to 90% pure. So it's when you get something that's a lot purer or stronger, you're also more likely to become dependent on the drug. So most people start off with smoking the drug and then might transition on to injecting. So the vast majority of people who use the drug in Australia are smokers of it. Australians are some of the biggest methamphetamine users in the world. Usually, and our proximity to Asia makes this drug also more used here. So the effects last 4 to 6 hours, and then people will come down, and this can last sort of 12 to 24 hours after they've used. When people, you know, become, you know, binge or become dependent users, we start to see more of this kind of messy or problematic behaviour. 1 in 4 people who become dependent on the drug will experience psychosis. So they can experience paranoia and aggression and that sort of thing. So it's not everyone who uses this drug becomes aggressive. It's more likely those that are dependent on it and also might have been also suffering from aggression as well. So in 2019, we had 1.1% of the New South Wales population reported using methamphetamines. And about 60% of those people actually only used it once or twice. So it's not everybody who's using it problematically. Even though we've got quite low levels of use of this drug in Australia, it is the second most popular drug that people seek treatment for in New South Wales after alcohol. So about 43% of presentations to drug and alcohol treatment is for alcohol, followed by methamphetamine. So cannabis used to be the second most commonly drug, but this has increased in the last 5 years. So if we look at the cost of it, so the powder form is about $175 a gram, or about $50 for a point. It can sometimes get to as low as $25 a point, And this is 1/10 of a gram. So someone who is a recreational user of the drug, it might be injecting or smoking, it might get 3 to 4 kind of hits out of it, out of a point. And you can also buy it in a gram, and that's up to $300 or sometimes $500. So this was one drug that during COVID seemed to get less pure, and there was less availability of it. But as we talked about in the first session, our drugs market is pretty pandemic proof, and it seems to be just as available now as it was sort of pre-COVID times. So I guess one of the important things to talk about is how methamphetamine affects the brain. And you can see these are the 3 main neurotransmitters that are affected when we use methamphetamine. So dopamine gives us pleasure and motivation, and there's no other drug that releases the amount of dopamine that this drug does. So from baseline, when you take methamphetamine, it can reduce the dopamine levels to up between 500 to 1200% more. So you can understand, why people would want to use the drug again. It also affects our noradrenaline, which is our fight or flight. So it artificially switches this on, which is when people so this is our fight or flight. And so this is where some of the kind of particularly when people use a lot of it, we can see some of the kind of more messy behavior, because people might feel frightened or feel more aggressive because they've had a lot of noradrenaline. And serotonin, as we said before, is also affected. So people might not sleep for a couple of days after they've had high levels of use. So the dopamine system runs through 2 parts of the brain, which are really important for high level sort of thinking. So we find that the areas of the brain that are most affected by methamphetamine is the prefrontal cortex, where our high level thinking takes place, and the limbic system, where our memory and emotional social processing takes place. And as I said, the dopamine system runs right through these parts of the brain. And meth basically disrupts the dopamine system, and some of the behaviours we see are a result of this. And so emotional and higher thinking create disrupted messages between the two, and the 2 areas of the brain have to function properly for us to understand what we see and experience. So a good example of this is, for example, if a cat might jump in front of us, we get a fright, and the limbic system will say, "What was that?" And the frontal lobe will tell us, "It's okay, it's just a cat." But you can see, if people's brains aren't working properly, that they can't kind of reason what might be happening. And so therefore they see and might experience things that are not necessarily happening. So you can see a low dose of this drug. It's like, your foot's full on the throttle. People experience sort of euphoria at very high levels, increased confidence and alertness and motivation, talkativeness. They also get an increased energy and heart rate and body temperature, and also it can increase people's sex drive. And, here we can sort of see the more messy behaviour that can happen with what we would call binge use. So, when, people go up and often they don't want to kind of come down, and so they'll keep taking that drug. And eventually what they'll do is, at some stage we know that what comes up has got to come down. And the more you take, the more harsh the come down is going to be. And so this is where we start to see some of this aggressive and hostile behaviour, nervousness and agitation, and psychotic symptoms, and overdose and stroke and seizure can also happen at this level. So the crash phase, which usually happens in the 12 to 24 hours after people have stopped using, it's like what we'd call the hangover phase. People could experience exhaustion and fatigue, sleep disturbances, a typically flat mood, as opposed to, what it was like being high, can have cravings for the drugs, and they can have generalized aches and pains experiencing it. So you can, these are some of the long-term effects of using methamphetamine. So again, because it's such a strong central nervous system depressant, people can experience weight loss due to not, eating. Basically, people might not sleep for 1 to 2 days, and most of us who might have had children will know what it's like to not have sleep for a day, and you can be kind of like pretty messy the next day. Well, if you've had, no sleep for a couple of days, you've also depleted all of the neurotransmitters in your brain, you can see why, you know, we get some of the bad kind of behaviour that can happen with it. Meth also decreases saliva, so people can get, and saliva keeps their mouths clean. So this is often referred to as meth mouth. And so people can experience dental problems. They can also get infections in their gum that can affect their heart. They're more susceptible to colds and flus. They can have trouble concentrating. Again, a lot of this is related to the dopamine system, muscle stiffness and breathlessness and anxiety and paranoia and depression. It has quite a significant impact on the heart, particularly, and some of the muscles around the heart. So we're seeing increased risk of sort of stroke and heart attack. You know, people become dependent on it. So you might remember from last week, the first lecture, we talked about the amount of people that get dependent. It's usually about 1 in 9 people with this drug. The drug's quite expensive, so people can have, you know, financial, work and social problems. We are seeing deaths increase with this drug. So since 2010, we've seen a 4-fold increase in the amount of deaths. So it's about 300 deaths at the moment associated with this drug. It's actually doubling of deaths in the last 10 years. So we get approximately 300 people dying in Australia per year, and most of that's related to drug toxicity. So we are seeing problems with heart disease, stroke, and suicide is also associated with becoming dependent on this drug, and about 1 in 4 people who use it. I guess one of the other important things to talk about with methamphetamine is the damage to the dopamine system. And a lot of the research is showing that it can take up to 1 to 2 years after people have become dependent on the drug for the dopamine system to return to normal. And dopamine, basically, when you get too much dopamine in your brain, it produces psychosis. If you get too little dopamine in your brain, it's been linked to depression. But we are also sort of seeing some studies coming out that people are now might be twice as likely to suffer from Parkinson's disease because of damage to the dopamine neurons. So it's a pretty nasty drug if you get dependent on it. And as I said before, arguably one of the most difficult drugs to mention to manage within a family situation, or if you're got a close relationship with someone. So this is what an overdose or a toxicity associated with the drug looks like. So agitation, overheating, excessive sweating. So again, if you're seeing any of this type of behaviour, particularly the fast heart rate and breathing and psychosis and stuff, it's really important to get the person to medical treatment as soon as possible. If you mix this, so it's not good to mix with other drugs like MDMA or cocaine, because this obviously places additional stress on the heart and can lead to stroke. It can also, again, be dangerous to mix with the MOIs, which is the first generation antidepressants. And we know that a lot of people, in order to sleep after it, will sometimes use cannabis or Valium to get to sleep, to try and get over the come down. But any extra drugs that you take into the system can increase the chances of toxicity. I think it's also really important to point out too, methamphetamines can also mask the effects of alcohol. So people might not feel as drunk as they would because it's like one drug is overriding the effects of the other. But it doesn't mean that your blood alcohol level is not increasing. So important thing to note. So some harm reductions around this drug. So again, I guess if you're working with a client that's using this drug, try to encourage self-regulation, so less of the drug is going to give, more of effect. The more you use, the more messy, the come down is going to be. And again, are more likely people are going to come dependent on it. So try to avoid binging on the drug. Because this will, possibly result in developing psychosis. So the more of that you have, the more dopamine you're likely to release, the more chance you are of getting a psychosis. Just some basic harm reduction advice, basically make sure you're well before you use it, that you're well hydrated, that you've eaten a good meal, and that you try to drink water and rest and sleep and recover after it. I guess where we saw quite high levels of use was particularly amongst the LGBTQI community, and it was known to be a particularly powerful sexual stimulant. So really important to remind clients to practice safe sex. If you're smoking it, use a glass pipe. So these used to be available, in sex shops, but they're no longer available. Although I think you can buy them online still. So try to not smoke them out of a cracked light bulb or use aluminium foil, because again, this can be quite dangerous where possible. And injecting would be one of the most dangerous ways to use a drug, basically because you've got all the bloodborne viruses and etc. and vein damage that can happen through injecting. And if you're snorting, make sure you rinse your nose out with clean water to regularly reduce the risk of natal damage, and make sure that you cut the ice up pretty, crystal methamphetamine up quite finely. And don't use alone. And this is a message we have for all of drugs, because when something goes wrong, at least you can have somebody to help or call for help if it's needed. Okay, if you've got any questions about that, Susie's done quite a lot of work on methamphetamine and particularly treatment. So I've asked her if she's willing to help answer any questions about that. So we're going to go on to our third drug that we'll look at today, which is cocaine. And this poll is asking for approximately how long do the effects of cocaine last if you snort it? So 15 minutes, 30, 45, 60 or 90 minutes. And I'll leave the poll open for another 5 seconds for people to answer that. Okay, end polling there. Thank you for that. So, we got a tie here. Most people either picked 30 minutes or 60 minutes. The correct answer is actually 60 minutes, approximately 60 minutes. But if you put 45 minutes, I'd give you half a mark if I was marking this as an assessment. So again, it would probably depend on the purity of the drug too, which is quite variable in Australia. Okay, so let's just look at some facts around cocaine. So this drug is mainly produced in Colombia, and that's where our supply comes from. Interestingly, when I used to work in Indonesia, after Indonesia became independent of the Dutch administration, they had huge plantations of cocaine in Indonesia. And they were all pulled out basically when the Dutch left the country. So if they had stayed there, I'm sure we would have had a lot more cocaine in Australia than we currently have. But as I said, most of ours comes from Colombia via South Africa. The Colombian market is basically the biggest market in the world. So it's also produced in Peru and Bolivia. So we have two main forms of it. So we have crystalline hydrochloride, which is the powder form. This is the most prevalent form that we have in Australia. We don't actually have any freebase or crack cocaine here unless people are manufacturing it themselves. So where you tend to get high amounts of crack cocaine is when you get an oversupply in the market. And even though, and we haven't got to that place, but certainly a lot of drug researchers in the field are really worried about what's happening with cocaine in Australia, because we have seen a market increase in the drug coming into the country. So it's a very fast acting stimulant, and it can also be used as a topical anesthetic. So it's often used in sort of surgery with nose. And purity and availability of the drug is increasing in Australia. So from an Australian Crime Commission report that was put out in last year, actually 2020, they found that the annual median purity ranged from 41% in Queensland up to 79% in South Australia. In New South Wales, the purity averages around 62%. Now, generally, the cost of the drug ranges between $300 to $350, but it can go up to $500. So it's really very, very expensive. Now, most people who would buy a gram of the drug might rack it up into 10 to 15 10 to 15 lines. So that would make it around sort of $30 a line of cocaine. And if it lasts only for an hour, you can see it's pretty expensive. You can also buy it in what's in caps, which is about 0.2 of a gram, and this ranges from $50 to $100. So we saw a doubling of the use of this drug between the 2019 to the 2016 to 2019 survey. But in the 20 to 29-year-old age group, it tripled in that age group, which is the age group that people are more likely to be using illicit drugs. And you can see here the amount of seizures have increased by over 800% in the last decade. So from 2010 up to 2020, we've seen an over 800% increase in the amount of drugs coming into this country. So I think the cartels have realised that Australians like their drugs, they like cocaine particularly, and they're prepared to pay a lot of money for it. So the price of the drug is, might range about over in Europe and the UK, about $80 a gram. So you can see if we're paying $300 to $500 per gram, we're paying up to sort of 5 to 7 times more for it. So the vast amount of ways that people will use it is intranasally. So they'll basically, snort it through the nose. It can also be injected, and if people smoke it, it's usually a different form of it, so a free base, and it's gone through one other purity process. And again, if you smoke it, it'll take about 15 minutes for the high to last, and so that's why it's quite kind of addictive. So this is the third most addictive drug of all of the ones, and we talked about this in the first webinar series. So the most addictive drug is basically tobacco, followed by heroin, followed by cocaine. So we are certainly worried about the increase of the amount of people using this drug. So within minutes of snorting the drug, people will begin to feel its effects, and they can last up to an hour. And depending on how much you use or how pure the drug is, people may experience, those effects listed on the right-hand side of your slide. So increased sense of euphoria and well-being, increased blood pressure and heart rate and body temperature, alertness and energy and self-confidence. People might also get more sexually aroused. They'll have a loss of appetite, again, related to the stimulant effects of the drug. And if they've had a lot of it, might experience headaches and dizziness. And this is also more likely to happen if people consume it with alcohol, which is a common way it's used. So more frequent long-term use of cocaine, again, dependence. About 1 in 5 or 6 people who try cocaine are estimated to become dependent on it. People might experience sleeping problems, so insomnia and exhaustion, particularly if they've had quite a lot of it. Nosebleeds can happen. People can also damage their septum in their nose from snorting it too much. So there've been some celebrities who have basically blown out their whole septum, where that's kind of, this is not usually going to happen with people who are using it once or twice, but if you are kind of using it a lot, this is one of the areas that can be damaged. Again, use too much of it can lose an interest in sex, and people can also become impotent with it. Paranoia and depression, anxiety, again, because it works on our dopamine levels, and people can get a psychosis, so seeing or hearing things that are not really used, particularly in high amounts of using this drug. If people inject this drug, it can also be really problematic, and we don't have a lot of cocaine injecting at the moment in Australia, but again, because it's such a fast-acting stimulant, we can see that people who are dependent on it might be injecting up to 20 times a day, and whereas most dependent heroin users might inject once or twice or maybe 3 times a day, if you're injecting up to 20 times a day, there's a lot of vein damage that can kind of happen. And that's just because of how fast the drug works on the central nervous system. So this is what an overdose or toxicity looks like, you know, with cocaine. So people are getting nauseous and vomiting and having strong heart palpitations or chest pains or tremors, or increase in body temperatures or heart rate, etc. It's really important that they go and seek medical attention. So we are having deaths increasing with this drug, also in Australia because of higher levels of use of this group. This is something I mentioned before. So we are seeing a lot of people that use cocaine will mix alcohol with it. And this basically forms a toxic metabolite in the liver, which is called cocaethylene, which is particularly dangerous to the heart. And we know that people also suffer a bigger hangover with using this drug. They're also more likely to become paranoid or aggressive when the two drugs are combined. And it's, again, dangerous to mix with the other psychostimulant drugs because of the strong impact on the heart and raising the risk of heart attack and seizures and strokes. And again, you know, many people will use Valium or Xanax or something to get to sleep after using cocaine, maybe even kind of cannabis. And again, you know, this is more likely to result in toxicity and overdose. So the less of drugs we mix into our system, the less likely we are to get drug toxicity associated with it. Just wanted to flag this one. This was a drug warning that was put out by New South Wales Health, again, earlier this year in June, basically finding that cocaine was mixed with certain opioids. Now, again, we had quite a few deaths happening with this in the Netherlands about 5 or 6 years ago. And there was basically heroin mixed in with the cocaine. And so, again, you know, opioids are far more likely to result in overdose. And it's not something we think about carrying a drug like naloxone, which reverses the effects of an opiate overdose. And I'll talk a little bit more about that drug next week. But again, you know, this is why I think we need drug checking to be immediately introduced into Australia so that we basically don't get these purities getting mixed in our drug supply. So people are buying cocaine and they get something very different to what they asked, what they were getting. So again, this harm reduction poster on the left-hand side of your slide is available in the public domain if people want further information about it. So again, you know, some quick harm reduction tips on this one. So if you're snorting, make sure the cocaine is finely crushed to avoid nasal damage. I guess with, you know, with COVID, it's really important that people don't share straws again, or don't share any injecting equipment, also because of risk of hepatitis C, because sometimes people will get sort of small amounts of blood when they're in basically snorting the drug. Try to avoid banknotes. They're dirty, you know, they've touched lots of hands. So use your own tube or straw, or even roll up some glossy magazine paper. Rinse your nostrils with water between snorts to reduce the risk of nasal damage. Try to avoid mixing cocaine with alcohol, particularly a lot of alcohol, to avoid this cardiovascular toxicity or cocaethylene. And if you plan to use multiple doses, try to reduce the size of your lines as the night goes on, rather than make bigger lines. Again, you know, this is not necessarily, more of the drug doesn't necessarily equal better effect. Once you start to have a lot more drug, it could get a lot more risky for toxicity. And I think this is a really important one with cocaine. So try to set limits on the amount of cocaine you use each session, so bigger doses aren't going to capture the first rush. And if you're smoking it, use a glass pipe rather than an aluminium can to smoke, and try to avoid using cocaine regularly. And if you're finding it hard to go without, it's probably time to take a break or to seek help from a medical professional. So I hope that's given you some information around cocaine. So the last drug we're going to cover today is ketamine. And we've got a little poll on this one, which I will just put up now. So one of the main long-term problems associated with regular cannabis use is bladder and kidney problems, hypoxia, overdose, heart attack, stroke. So I'll leave that open for another 15 more seconds. For those of you who can answer that, that would be great. So this was a drug that was often talked about in the media as a horse tranquilizer, and it is used a lot in veterinary medicine, as well as in particularly in low income sort of settings. So it was used a lot during the Vietnam War. Okay, we'll end polling. Oh, well done. For those of you who picked bladder and kidney problems, give yourselves a clap. That was the correct answer. So 15 of you got that one right. It's very rare to overdose from this drug, and that's why it's got some really interesting effects on how it works on the central nervous system. So it's actually classified as a dissociative anesthetic, and what that does is it disassociates people from reality. So this was used a lot in, and it's used still a lot in Russia, for operations, but it was used a lot during the Vietnam War. And basically what could do is that you didn't need an anaesthetist necessarily at the time to do this. So a doctor could give you some of the drug, you would be disassociated from reality, and people could do an operation on you. So it keeps your heart pumping, so people don't necessarily overdose from them, because it's not a pure depressant like that. So we have seen the use of this of ketamine increase in Australia and in New South Wales. So even though less than 1% of the population reported using it, it doubled in use between the 2016 to the 2019 survey. So it costs approximately $200 per gram. It's often diverted from medical settings and or from veterinary practices. So it's more often used to tranquilize cats rather than horses, which is why it's not necessarily correct to call it a horse tranquilizer. It's usually snorted through a bumper, and I've got a picture of a bumper coming up on the next slide, but it can also be dissolved in liquid and swallowed, and sometimes also injected. Sometimes people will smoke it with tobacco or cannabis. It can also be shafted or injected intramuscularly. And it produces a feeling of disassociation and detachment from self and reality, which can last between 45 to 60 minutes. And again, we're doing some clinical trials into this drug and assessing how ketamine can be used as a treatment for depression. And there's certainly some early indications to show that this is a good result. There's some good results with that, but it's obviously not listed yet for the treatment of that. So some of the effects that people have experienced with it is, euphoria and relaxation, feelings of disassociation. So some people might use the drug thinking that it's speed or crystal methamphetamine, but then they find themselves in a fairly disassociated state, which can be quite kind of scary. So not everyone likes the effects of this drug. It can also produce hallucinations, particularly if you have it in larger doses, impaired motor coordination, eye twitching, nausea, vomiting. Anaphylaxis can happen with it, so some people are allergic to it. And people can get increased libido and reduced pain sensitivity and anesthesia. So some people who don't like opiate drugs find that this drug can be quite good to replace opioids. So sometimes it's good given post-operatively as well. So some regular users will experience flashbacks associated with it. It can impair aspects of memory and cognitive function. Long-term users have also found that repeated use of ketamine has been linked to personality and mood disorders, including paranoia, egocentrism, and reduced ability to concentrate, and also in depression. And where we're finding, and this was some studies that came out because they've got quite high levels of use of ketamine, particularly in the UK. And I remember seeing a paper presented by Adam Winstock, who was doing a lot of treatment with people with ketamine disorder, and a lot of them had kind of severe. So it seems to thread the bladder, and then people get bladder and kidney problems with it, which are not reversible. So it can be quite dangerous with long-term use of that. So here on the left-hand side of your slide is the bumper. So this is how some people might snort it. This is a little kind of wheel on this, and this will give you a little kind of snort of it if it's in powder form. So this is something that's referred to as the Khole, and some people find this a really kind of scary state, and it's often referred to as an emergent state. So it can be, you know, people that are more like the hallucinogenic drugs might find this drug more attractive than others that are expecting a bit more of a kind of high. And this is like a trip-like experience characterized by hallucinations and disorientation and invincibility and ability to communicate with others. And you can see it doesn't suppress breathing or heart rate. So deaths from overdose of this drug are rare, but this can be a pretty kind of scary state for people. And particularly if they're not expecting that, you know, they can feel quite kind of paranoid and certainly not in a very kind of happy space. So we've also got some harm reduction information on this drug, again, by Talking Drugs or UK Release. Got these posters in the public domain. So I think the central message with this one is to go slow and stay low, particularly if you're using it for the first time. It's very difficult to keep a sense of time when using ketamine. So if you're planning on redosing, you know, people recommend setting a timer on your phone and leaving at least 30 minutes between doses. Avoid using it too frequently. So you can see here, you know, that in the UK, they're recommending that you leave about 4 months between dosing because of the permanent effects on the bladder and on the kidneys. If you're going to snort it, make sure that the ketamine's finely crushed. Don't share straws or bumpers or other snorting devices because of the risk of transmitting bloodborne viruses. But also in the time of COVID, this is particularly kind of concerning. Try to use in a calm and safe environment with people that you know and you trust, because again, you know, when we talked about the drug, person and setting, the setting can really make a real difference with this drug. If you're using alcohol and ketamine together, it can increase the chances of experiencing the Khole, and particularly larger doses of this drug can result in people, you know, getting into this kind of pretty scary sort of state. Try to avoid mixing the old school benzos, which are known as barbiturates, and opioids, because this can lead to unpredictable reactions. And avoid mixing it with stimulant drugs such as methamphetamine, cocaine, and MDMA, because it can increase blood pressure and heart rate, which can be dangerous for heart attacks and strokes and seizures. And again, you know, many of these drugs are often used in combination with each other. So less is more is always the best message for people. Okay, that's it from me. Are there any sort of questions or comments there, Susie, or anyone else?
Thanks, Annie. I'll just jump on my video. We do have one question in the inbox currently, and it's asking about the New South Wales alerts. Now, that's a relatively new thing. The New South Wales Ministry of Health and the Centre for Alkaline Other Drugs actually set up a unit that that provides, really triangulates information coming in through emergency departments and also from consumers. So NUA is obviously very much at the seat in relation to that process. But if you want to receive those alerts, you actually have to go onto the New South Wales Health website to access them. And anyone can do that. They are public facing, but at this stage, as I understand it, and Annie, perhaps you have some more information, but I understand it, it's not necessarily the case that you can receive it via email, or am I incorrect about that?
Yeah, that's what I understood too. I mean, more often than not, I see them often shared via you know, newer Dancewise, or I also follow New South Wales Health on social media, so I have to get them through
yes, that comes out. Got it. So you could be doing that.
Yeah.
So strongly encourage people to pop some questions into the Q&A box, which is down at the bottom of your screen. I've got another question here for you, Annie. how to communicate with someone who has used ice or methamphetamine, and any tips on keeping in mind when completing casework in child protection with parents who use ice regularly. So maybe we'll split that in half. Yeah, go ahead, Annie.
I was going to say, I think you are best placed to answer that question, having done a lot of counselling with people who use methamphetamine. So I might kind of go over to you and then fill in any other bits I know.
Thank you.
Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's totally fine. So that is true. I used to manage the stimulant treatment program at St Vincent's and still see clients today who use methamphetamine. I think the first part of your question is really about understanding that the first thing is those people who use methamphetamine and perhaps have developed a dependence would have experienced a great deal of stigma and discrimination. And so their fear will be at an all-time high about people talking with them about it. And so I suppose the most important thing I would say is to try to come to the conversation with lots of compassion, to appreciate the difficulty of changing of their use. But similarly, in the case of, say, child protection, absolutely being clear and about the potential harms that this drug can have, and the fact that the use of methamphetamine can get in the way of connecting with people. So in this case, with children, and so children can be a really good catalyst for change. And so if you can, I suppose you're coming at it with really appreciating people might be quite fearful about talking about their use, but that there is an opportunity for them, and what you're trying to do is really step into that harm reduction space. So, ensuring that when people are using, that the children are safe. Is there someone else that they could be staying with for the time that the use is going on? And I suppose being really transparent about what your concerns might be for the people who are using and for the children as well. But really taking from that position that people want to do the best by their children and perhaps are concerned about their use. And so really trying to link them in with other services would also be useful. And the last part of your question is just around when you're completing casework. Presumably, perhaps if you're drawing things to a close, it's ensuring that those people have really good supports in place. So if the pressure mounts, perhaps use continues or begins to escalate, that they've got some really good supports in place. They know where to reach out for some help. Annie, have you got anything else you wanted to answer, to sort of add to that?
Well, I was just going to kind of take on your point that you were saying about stigma and discrimination. I think arguably that has been something that the media did a really bad job at. And I think that is, one of the things we talked about, I think, a lot in the first lecture was about how difficult that makes it for people then to access kind of treatment. Yeah. And a lot of the stuff, we saw a lot of really bad messaging around methamphetamine that just made these people less likely to access treatment. And I think
that's
one
right.
of the things. Yeah,
go ahead.
And no, I was just going to sort of say, I think sort of working with people like yourself and Khole about it, a lot of people do quite well in treatment with methamphetamine when they do it. And particularly one of the things that causes people to come to treatment is experiencing a psychosis, and that can be such a scary thing in a way. And so they are very motivated around treatment. I guess one of the difficulties with treating people is that they feel depressed for such a long time, after they've stopped using, just because of the damage to the dopamine system. So just to be aware of that. And we don't have really that many effective pharmacotherapies with this drug. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that one further. There are some clinical trials happening at the moment in Australia around this.
I mean, I think the key, a couple of points there that are really key is a lot of people who use methamphetamine may not really understand how the drug works. So it is quite useful to provide that psychoeducation that Annie's been talking about today, so that they understand why they are the high highs and the low lows, and what they can do best to sort of to take good care of themselves. In terms of the pharmacotherapy, yeah, the current trials are looking at a longer acting dexamphetamine, which is lisdexamphetamine. Previously, the use of dexamphetamine as a substitute, the difficulty was it's a short-acting drug, whereas methamphetamine is quite a long-acting drug. And so people were having to take their medication quite regularly. It wasn't like a methadone or buprenorphine situation where you could have your dose and then be quite comfortable for the rest of, 24, 48 hours. So we're still working on that. And the reality is, though, treatment does work for people who use methamphetamine. The issues that we've really seen are exactly as Annie has said. For a lot of these people, because of the stigma, they wait a very long time to reach out for support. And so over time, obviously, the longer you use a drug, particularly in a problematic way, then potentially you've got the potential there for it to become quite entrenched, and that makes it a little more difficult. But I can say, having worked with people alongside people who use this drug regularly, it is absolutely possible to reduce and to cease use and to live, very productive and happy lives. So it is really about ensuring that treatment options are given to people, and that we try to treatment match as best we can. Another question for you, Annie. You mentioned in the use of methamphetamine, the use of light bulbs, or aluminium foil, in order to take the drug. Can you speak a little bit about what some of the dangers might be that are associated with using that sort of way of smoking the drug?
Yeah, well, I guess it's there's more. I mean, it's a pretty kind of toxic drug for your lungs, this one as well. And then light bulbs are really fine glass, so that they can kind of shatter. So there's danger with that. Also, aluminium foil, when you're sort of smoking off that, it produces a lot of other sort of chemicals, as well as you're inhaling. So it's just about basically, reducing the risk. And it's more about kind of cuts with the light bulbs and stuff like that. And, Kmart was actually banned from selling one of its light bulbs because it looked like a meth pipe. Well, they banned that bulb from being smoking, but it's just that you're also inhaling other kind of like nasty toxins at the same time as using it. So therefore a glass pipe's on a harm reduction sense better.
Yeah, thank you, Annie. And then another question here about upcoming webinars regarding working with people who misuse pain on all prescribed medications. So we do indeed. You will be doing one of those, Annie, around opioids.
Yes, I'll be talking about opioid drugs next webinar, and we've seen a big increase in the use of those drugs, and there's been a lot of marketing of them by pharmaceutical companies, and particularly we've seen a 15-fold increase in the last 10 years of the prescribing of those type of drugs. So and I guess a lot of us would have heard about what's happening with the opioid crisis in America. We're usually about 10 years behind in Australia, but it's certainly kind of like they've certainly reached us over here. And we are seeing, the overprescribing of it, and particularly the longer acting and the stronger form of opiate drugs, which are used to treat cancer pain. So we'll spend a lot of time talking about that and benzodiazepines next week, and also talk a little bit about overdose prevention, particularly using Narcan or naloxone and how that works.
Fantastic, Annie. I think it's really helpful for us to, as a sector, whether you're working in health or other related fields, to be aware too that as of end of August, there will be the introduction of real-time prescription monitoring, which was introduced in Victoria, and that is to say that those who are being prescribed drugs of dependence like pain medications, their prescribers will be under some pressure to review the ways in which they prescribe. And so obviously we as a peak body have been raising some of our concerns about what the impacts might be on our client groups, particularly if there's a quick reduction or ceasing of the prescribing of pain medications, which people have a valid reason for using. And certainly, they're not prescribing to themselves, someone is prescribing to them. So there's some complexity on the horizon, but I think it's safe to say that it is useful for us to think about why and how people use the drugs they do. And certainly in terms of the pain side of things, there's an excellent website via the Agency for Clinical Innovation, and that's the Pain Network. And they've got lots of really good tools and resources around supporting people who may be experiencing chronic pain. So I would recommend that you have a look at those. One further question here asks about tips for discussing methamphetamine use with clients who also have an intellectual disability in the child protection context. Would you like me to respond to that?
Yes, I'd love you to take that. Thank you.
That's fine.
Beforehand, I said, if there's any ones about treatment, you're doing them. You've done real-time treatment.
No problem, no problem. So I think in this case, what once again is really helpful is some of that psychoeducation. So it's breaking down so you understand how the drug works on the body, as Eddie's been describing today, and maybe Googling a few other resources. And there's a few things through Cracks in the Ice and CETA. There's lots of stuff out there, actually. And they've got lots of good pictures. And what I would be recommending that you do is that you really go for the visual in explaining to someone how the drug works and therefore how the drug shapes how we feel and how we might then behave. And so I think those sorts of devices are really helpful. The other thing to alert you to is also there's a whole program of work that's been done in collaboration with lots of NGO providers and LHD providers around working with people with co-occurring cognitive impairment and drug and alcohol issues. And there's a whole set of tools that you can be using with people who may have cognitive impairment. And so I could really recommend that. And we can certainly, there's some links through some of our messages, but the program itself is called the ACE program and the Alcohol and Drug Cognitive Impairment program, and you can have access to all of these different tools. And so there might be some really useful things within that suite of tools that could be helpful. Now, we haven't got any other questions at the moment. Were there any other things that you wanted to emphasize, Annie?
Well, one thing I was just going to mention that I remember you using a lot in education around methamphetamine was something called Meth in the Brain that's on YouTube, which is a really good way to sort of show people, and often, you know, people respond quite well to videos. And that's a great tool to have, and it often opens up a conversation around that sort of thing. So I've just got, I've just got some sort of just information about where to go for further information. So this is a really good kind of book that is produced by the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre. It's all evidence-based information. It summarises all of the drugs in a really kind of succinct and easy way. So this is available through the Your Room website, and there's hard copies of it still available as well. The Alcohol and Drug Foundation also has some good information. It's all evidence-based, and also particularly focusing on for New South Wales is the New South Wales Health Your Room. So they don't have so much information around the harm reduction stuff, but they're really good with, you know, what does the drug do, what effect does it have, etc. And this is something I produced to support the ASSIST, which is the alcohol and other drugs sort of screening tool. And I produced these fact sheets for clinicians, which goes through about 15 drugs, and these are available through the ASSIST portal. And it's basically, what drug is this and what does it look like, what does it feel like, and there's also harm reduction information and other information to consider, which is a really good kind of tools to provide for you to get knowledgeable about it, but also to provide to your clients. And Harm Reduction Victoria also does some really great harm reduction advice, but if they're more interested in the party drugs and stuff, then you also can't go through past Dancewise run by the New South Wales Users and AIDS Association, which is a great resource. And there's some more useful resources and information we've gone through. Some of the harm reduction advice that I talked to about some of the, particularly MDMA and ketamine and stuff, comes from Loop UK, and they're looking at trying to set up harm reduction and drug testing services here in Australia, and they provide really good information, particularly around the kind of more clubbing drugs that are used in the clubbing sort of sense. So that's it from me. So next week, as I said, we'll be finishing off, we'll do the final one in this series, which is looking at basically a bit of a sort of history of opioids in Australia and benzodiazepines, and also naloxone and overdose prevention. So I look forward to seeing you the same time, same place next week. And thanks for answering some of those tricky questions on meth for me, Susie. I appreciate it. And for your attention. And
no problem at all.
Attention. And we will send you a PDF copy of this presentation as well, so for your further information.
Thank you so much, Annie. Yeah, we make a good team. I really appreciate you all joining us today. The other thing I just remind everybody is, if you don't work directly in the alcohol and other drug sector, we'd really recommend that try to reach out to your local treatment provider, build some connections with them. I'm sure they would be more than happy to come in, have a morning tea with you, talk through what they do, how they can support you best. Try not to be alone in this sector. It's really important that we all support each other. Really take good care of yourself out there, whatever you're doing. And we hope you can join us, and Annie in particular, next week. Thanks a lot. See you later, everyone.